Hello, and welcome. I'm Mehran Khalili. We're DM25, a radical political movement for Europe. And this is another live stream with subversive ideas you won't hear anywhere else. And tonight, we'll be looking once again at Israel's genocide in Gaza, one of the defining outrages of our time, and the quiet role of big tech in it. We have with us, of course, our own Yanis Varoufakis, and our returning guest is David Adler of the Progressive International. As regular viewers will know, David was a member of the global Samud Flotilla, an aid effort to break Israel's blockade of Gaza. And he was abducted in international waters and detained in an Israeli desert prison for 5 days. So we'll be hearing directly from David about what happened and what he learned that organizers can use. And then we'll pivot to look at the role of big tech in all this, because Gaza isn't just a battlefield, it's also a proving ground for AI, for surveillance, for the electronic warfare built by big tech and its partners. And those same tools are now turning up in Western policing and borders right here in Europe. So we'll dig into that with our guests. And of course, we have you out there. If you've got thoughts, comments, rants, questions for David or Yanis, put them in the YouTube chat and we'll put them to our panel. David, let's start with you. I mean, the story of the global Samud Flotilla is obviously out there, but if we can start at the moment that the boat was stopped, what happened next?
First of all, I want to thank you and thank Yanni and really thank all of DM25, my political home here in Europe, and for so much support, emotional, political, personal, throughout the mission. I think it's very easy to tell the story of the flotilla backwards as opposed to forwards and say, for example, switching off your televisions on the night of interception, they were always going to be fine. This was a group of just privileged activists who were just enjoying their selfie yachts and celebrity tours of the Mediterranean. But I think, and we'll get into this today, I think that the fact that I'm able to speak to you today, the fact that I'm back home and back on DMTV is a testament to the mobilizations that we saw all across Europe that were led in so many places by DMers, by our friends and allies across the continent, in Europe in particular, who raised their voices, who joined together with trade unions to block ports and beyond. So I just want to start with an expression of my sincerest gratitude, and I know I speak for so many of my friends and comrades as part of the Global Samud Flotilla in that sincere expression, and debt that we hope to repay now that we're back in our homes and with our families in our respective political communities. And so from your question, Mehran, we can get right into it and telling a bit of the story that was under the cover of darkness, we might say. I think that it was a remarkable thing for me coming out of prison to try to see what kind of coverage were people asking questions about what really happened to us. And it seemed like once we were illegally and violently abducted at sea on that Wednesday night, many of the journalists simply said, well, okay, this game of cat and mouse is over. We can finally turn back to our regular lives. But really, I think for those of us who were on the flotilla, that's where the nightmare began. That's where the terror protocols were really introduced. And that's where I think a lot of the true nature of the Zionist regime was most revealed to us, and where I'm most excited to tell this story. So as you mentioned, we were abducted under the cover of darkness because, of course, Israeli Navy, to maintain as wide a swathe of non-accountability or of impunity, were jamming our signals at the same time as they were trying to ram our boats. So as we saw in the case of 2010, when they slaughtered activists on the Gaza Freedom Flotilla, it was clear that they wanted to maximize their ability to say and frame and describe the events of that evening and beyond however they want, knowing full well that the gullible, if not outright complicit journalists in Europe's mainstream media, but in particular in my home country, United States mainstream media, were going to lead with the Israeli official narrative counterposed to whatever the activists were going to say. So we had this frenetic night at sea where we were being chased by a giant naval barge before we were, violently abducted like pirates in international waters. I mean, it's important to denormalize some of this story because if any other state in the world or to have done something so criminal, so illegal, so violent to a group of humanitarian workers, grandmothers and grandfathers, school teachers and nurses from around the world. We would be so shocked as there would be, such a, an uprising, not just on the streets, but in the halls of global governance and international institutions. But really, it was when we got to port that the nightmare began. Now, I had, for my sins over the course of this trip across the Mediterranean, I think each of us who were on the flotilla, what made it such a privilege, but also such a specific responsibility, was that we were all representing communities broader than ourselves. So whether you were a student representing the conscience of young people, whether you were a medic and you were representing a whole profession that has been systematically targeted through destruction of hospitals in Gaza, whether you were even an intellectual or an academic trying to stand up against the scholasticide in Gaza, each of us represented different things. And in my case, I represented a large, well, I shouldn't say large, a growing population of the Jewish community that is trying to stand up for our values, for our heritage, and for a political tradition that is fundamentally anti-Zionist. Not for 1 year or 2 years, not for 10 years, but for over a century. And that's, the family that I come from, who stood up to the Nazis in the resistance here on the European continent, but who knew full well way back then that the Zionist project was one that sought to rob us of our culture, a Yiddish culture, an anti-fascist culture, a culture grounded in tikkun olam, healing the world, social justice, and sought to replace that with one of a settler colonial violence and occupation, and usurping some of those symbols that once adorned my synagogue in service of that project. It's now forthrightly genocidal in its aims, ambitions, and daily practice. And so I had kind of sewn this Jewish star onto my sweater in the days prior to arrival, and it wasn't a coincidence that I was celebrating this as a kind of almost celestial coincidence that we were arriving on the eve of Yom Kippur, that whatever sacrifice we could make as participants of this flotilla in terms of our safety, security, or whatever we were prepared to endure in the case of abduction, coincided with the holiest day of the Jewish calendar. That is Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, when we think across a year or many years of sins we have committed, of wrongs we have wronged, of people that we have injured, and we think about the ways to repair those relationships, to atone for those sins. And so this was really on my mind as we kind of came to the so-called red zone, as we heard over the walkie-talkies, over the radios that they were preparing to intercept our boats, was, wow, this is really special timing to, as the sun goes down, as we enter the fast, a fast that in my case lasted 6 days because we were fasting on the day of Yom Kippur, and I was hunger striking for the remainder of my time in Ketziot, the desert prison that you mentioned, Mehran. And it was such a clash of Jewish cultures. Here we were sailing on the Mediterranean in the name of Tikkun Olam, in the name of trying to heal the world, arriving on Yom Kippur, and here were the naval forces of the Israeli army, unrepentant, the S-13, famous baby killers, an elite force of the Israeli Navy, coming to intercept our boats and to further betray, further corrupt that tradition through such rogue violence against humanitarian workers, such illegal criminal acts committed against such decent people. Obviously, a fraction of the violence that they're committing on a daily basis when there's less attention granted by the international community in the occupied territories. And so I think they knew maybe who I was, or had a special eye for these Jews who were traveling on the flotilla. And, I think that to the Zionist imagination, there truly is nothing more dangerous than a Palestinian, that they at various times seek to deny their very existence with a line of propaganda that says there's no such thing as a Palestinian. What is Palestine? What is this place you're talking about? You couldn't find on a map. Or at other times, they seek to destroy the Palestinian, strip them of that right they have to ancestral territories. But the second scariest thing to a Zionist these days is an anti-Zionist Jew, is someone who disrupts or corrupts a narrative that we were sold as children. The state of Israel stands for our security, enacts that violence in the name of our self-defense that represents the totality of our ethnicity and religious tradition. So I'm digressing. We get to land, we get to Ashdod, and we're immediately beaten over the head, kicked around, and forced into a sort of terror pose, heads down, heads bowed, on our knees, and kicked around in the port. And they come, they find me in particular, and they read the name of my passport, and they're like, here's this Jewish kid. What are we going to do with this traitor to the cause, this capo, this self-hater, as I've been called in various times throughout my life, as I've tried to stand up for a different set of values that are more in line with solidarity with the people of Palestine and all oppressed peoples across the world. They ripped me from the group for a special photo opportunity with Ben Gavir, and they threw me in front of a big flag of the state of Israel that they wanted me to stare at face to face like this. While Minister Ben Gavir marched out of the port of Ashdod with a big flanked by his goons on all sides with their flashlights for his photo op, and came to yell in my face, "I'm Ben Gavir, the Minister of Security, and you are a terrorist," while the goons like surrounded and and attacked us kind of on the this was even before we were taken away and strip searched and zip tied and taken off to Getzia. So we always knew there was going to be this sort of special attention that was granted to the Jewish community that was there, but I didn't know how bad even it would get from there. When we were taking away to this desert camp, the people that they had designated as Jews were given special treatment. I shouldn't say the worst treatment, because I think the worst treatment was reserved for delegates that came from the Arab world, from countries deemed to be existential threats to Israel: Algeria, Tunisia, even Turkey. Muslims who were praying throughout the day and whose prayers would be met with riot gear, German shepherds, guns pointed at their heads and snipers at their chests, beaten and dragged away. But I remember one of the other Jews who was in my cell on the flotilla. They would come, and he was in desperate need for medical attention, which of course we were systematically denied in the course of our brief tenure in Kitsia. Just, I need to see a doctor. I need to see a doctor. I need to see a doctor. And I'll never forget the words of the prison guards facing us down, who said, "We do not give medicine to animals." And the way in which a language that was once deployed to dehumanize us as a people, in the case of the genocide committed against our community in the course of the 20th century in Europe, the way that that's been taken up. And of course, we've seen this deployed against Palestinians time and again at various times. They're vermin, they're insects, they're Amalek, who must be destroyed from the face of the planet. But it was very interesting to see the ways in which the kind of contract of the state of Israel that was once deployed to justify a lot of these acts of expansion, of irredentism in the name of our ethnicity, have now been deployed violently against their own people. So over the course of my time there, I was brought in once, twice, repeatedly to interrogation, brought in to see the Mossad agents. And in these interrogation, they would ask me one simple question: why are you here? Who paid you to come here? Who brought you here? Who coordinated this? Who facilitated your participation in this flotilla? Because they could not make sense of the idea that a youngish Jewish guy from California, born and bred in a Zionist community, going to Valley Beth Shalom and Alonim summer camp, would dare to confront this project and could find in his heart some expression of solidarity with the people of Palestine. And so, I think I was left with this lingering sense that something is coming apart, that in the great centrifuge of Israel's present political economy, driving itself further and further towards a radicalized right-wing project, that idea has completely come apart for the state of Israel. That's just as we're seeing in the United States, where they seek to strip citizenship of bad U.S. Americans who are insufficiently loyal to some Trumpist project. The same is true of the Jewish community in the state of Israel. Now, if you're a bad Jew, if you're considered a self-hater, if you're insufficiently loyal to the project that has become so forthrightly genocidal in its public expression, but has always sought to kind of dispossess and occupy these territories that belonged historically to the people of Palestine. If you're insufficiently loyal to that project, then you are an enemy of the state, and we will treat you as an animal. We will treat you as a terrorist, and you have no rights in a state that was born supposedly to protect, defend, and provide safe shelter to a people that once, had it lacked a state. So that's a bit about my experience. And I'm happy to walk through any more kind of individual episodes. I think the audience, those of us who are with us from DM and beyond will be kind of familiar with the general contours of the flotilla, its aims, ambitions, and kind of what it was like at sea. But I think, overall, the experience was one that left me even more committed and more determined to work with you all to, you know, communicates, especially having been in prison with so many fellow Europeans, Italians and Spaniards, and even Germans and Frenchmen, that, that no one is safe from the violence that is kind of enacted and deployed by this rogue state. They've lost the plot. And whether that's bombing 5 Arab countries in one day, or whether that's, igniting the terrorist protocol on 450 humanitarians who are just trying to deliver baby formula to the shores of Gaza. I think that, anyone who's either within the occupied territories or standing in solidarity with them is vulnerable and potentially victim to that great violent centrifuge that's now emerging from the state of Israel.
David, thank you so much for sharing that so eloquently. I mean, I'm quite speechless and stunned to hear it from you, even though I knew the details. Just hearing it now from you today, just oh, look. I would like to bring Yanis in, but before I do, I have one last question for you, because this wasn't the first flotilla, and there was an expectation that the flotilla would be, as Israel says, intercepted, that people may be abducted and detained. So, what was it for you that surprised you the most about the whole episode?
I will say that we were prepared psychologically for many different scenarios. And having been at sea for so long, there was a sense of just sort of we couldn't believe that we actually completed the mission to begin with. It wasn't just the bureaucratic warfare that sought to slow us down all along the way, right? And threatened to detain the mission at various points throughout it. It wasn't just the first, the second, or the third wave of drone strikes deliberately approved by Benjamin Netanyahu in international waters or in the port of Tunis against our flotilla. It wasn't just our amazement that the Greek government, so complicit, perhaps more than almost any other country in the EU, even more than Germany, perhaps, with its genocide in Gaza, because of its brave mobilization of Greek people, was forced to take a different approach to the flotilla as we curved into Cretan waters because of that swarm attack of drones a few nights before we were intercepted. So by the time we actually arrived into the so-called red zone, there was a sense of a historic kind of completion of at least one thing we promised to do, which was to do our best to reach the shores of Gaza. And so, of course, no, we understood that there were risks. We understood that there was a high likelihood, however scandalous we must insist that it was, and always has been, these interceptions, these abductions, we should really call them, these kidnappings, piracy on the high international seas. But what was most surprising to me was the abject treatment. I don't want to sugarcoat it. I mean, torture that was suffered by many of the people who were on these boats. I don't want to play into or further reify frameworks that value one life over another, that, grayscale the value of life based on the color of your skin. I do think, though, that it was surprising, you asked me what was surprising, that they would be willing, knowing that the eyes of the world were focused on this flotilla, to throw a grandma to the ground and break her leg, to deprive us of medical attention so badly that a woman was fainting once, twice, 3 times from such a bad kidney infection, that it took us 2 days to beg them for insulin for diabetics who were in their 60s and 70s on our flotilla, that people were threatened with rape, that they were beaten every day, cuffed at wrists and ankles so tightly that they either broke a bone or lost sensation in their hands and feet for days at a time without any medical attention, and thrown into isolation, thrown into solitary for hours, if not days, without access to food and water. I think that all of us were surprised, however naively you want to say this was, by the absolute commitment of the state of Israel to this violence, to this terror protocol, to the ways in which they completely lost the plot. And I think it's an important point for us to make from DM's perspective and from a more radical, as you say, more honest perspective, radical in the true Marxist sense of, or I guess we'd say a definitional sense of getting to the root of it, which is that it's very common now in more liberal circles or more establishment circles to say that a figure like Ben-Gvir is marginal. Yes, there are some crazies, they're in the cabinets, but there's some cooler heads in the judiciary or elsewhere in the Israeli government who are in charge. Okay, that might be true, but my experience was we were handed over on a platter to those crazies, and they enacted unbelievable violence against innocent people. And if you think that that's scandalous, you better wait to find out what's actually happening under the cover of genuine darkness, with all of the journalists targeted and assassinated in Gaza, with no international coverage allowed to even enter its territories. If you think what happened to us is scandalous, just you wait to find out how those crazies were unleashed in their genocidal rage on the people of Gaza. And the scale of that we don't comprehend. And I think it was, shocking, if not surprising, I will say, the extent to which they have ceased to care about global public opinion, and why that should give us more resolve to act not at the level of persuasion or even condemnation, but real policy changes. Because the only thing that's going to actually work is what worked with apartheid South Africa, is stripping away the concrete material relations of complicity that bind us to that violence, because they've lost the fucking plot. And I think that the sooner we wake up to the fact that there are no cooler heads in charge, that this is the state of Israel, this is the true face of that violence, the sooner we're going to be able to deliver on an agenda that truly corresponds to the severity and gravity of the humanitarian crisis, and corresponds also appropriately to the prospect for Palestinian liberation, true and genuine, enduring Palestinian liberation. That's not just throwing on to the Eiffel Tower an Israeli flag and a Palestinian flag and trying to sort of sing "Hey Jude" and go on with our lives. I think that was sort of one of the chief conclusions was, if I didn't believe that before, that there was going to be no way to break through at the level of discourse, but it needed to happen at a level of concrete measures. I think I'm certainly convicted of that now.
Thank you for that, David. Yanis, take it where you will, but what do you think is the core political lesson from what we've heard from David?
Well, there are two dimensions in which we can take this: the effect of the flotilla and of the treatment that David, you and your comrades were dished out. The first one is to recognize, through those experiences that you just related, the manner in which the madness, this orchestrated misanthropy, extends beyond the borders of Israel. Well, we don't even have borders for Israel, but that's another discussion. The land that Israel occupies. For instance, what's happening in the United States, what's happening in the in the European Union, how that madness has infected our politics in the West. That's one dimension. The second dimension is what effect your flotilla had, our flotilla had, on developments. So briefly on both. It is abundantly clear that the crazes that you described, Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, are not only dominant in the discourse in Israel and in the actions of the Israeli state, from prisons all the way to the Knesset, but they are also infecting the politics of the West, of Germany, of France, of Britain, of the United States. The fact that, I'll just give one example since we're here as part of the DM family. We are talking about, we're discussing these days, the celebrations of the 10th anniversary of DM25. We were inaugurated back on the 9th of February of 2016 in Berlin, and we had a fantastic event in the Volksbühne Theater in the heart of Berlin. And we were planning to have our anniversary there. We can't. We can't because the German state is going to find ways of banning us from celebrating the democratic radical movement that is DiEM25. And that's because of Palestine. That's because of the fact that it's an incontrovertible fact that the Netanyahus and the Smotriches and the Ben-Gvirs have extended their mad ideology and they have managed to ensnare the Federal Republic of Germany into replacing what used to be German militarist nationalism with that kind of ultra-Zionism. So you can see it. You can see it. We have a journalist in Germany as we speak, who, because of his pro-Palestinian, he's reporting what's happening in Palestine, right? If he's reporting what David has been discussing, he's become a non-person within the European Union, with following a decree that was issued in Brussels, essentially, prohibiting him from existing as a person. His bank account has been frozen. He's not allowed to travel, even within the European Union. He's a German citizen. So, none of that would have been possible had the Smotriches and then Ben-Gvir not taken over the asylum. Had their madness not become the official ideology, not just of Israel, but also of the pro-Zionist regimes in the West. So that's one dimension. The second dimension is, the impact. Now, I'm not going to say that this is just the flotilla's doing, but the flotilla was the crowning activist manifestation of a long series of protests. The protests in London, in Paris, in various capitals, and other cities around Europe, which slowly gathered pace until you had millions of people in the streets demonstrating the great chasm separating official policy from popular conventional wisdom, which was shifting very, very fast towards the anti-Zionist, pro-Palestinian, Free Palestine movement. With the March to Gaza, with the flotilla that you participated in, David, it became increasingly impossible for Zionist regimes in the West to continue as if nothing had changed. They were hemorrhaging votes, especially the center-left and center-right governments in Britain, in France, even in Germany. They were hemorrhaging votes to the either to the ultra-right or to, I would say, the left, or even to people who would abstain, would never vote for them again. So you have Keir Starmer in Britain realizing that whereas the Zionists all congregated in the reform Faragist quasi-fascist party or the Tories, center-leftists were moving away from him because of his explicit support of the genocide. And the flotilla, I think, was the moment when the tipping point, and you could see that because while you were at sea, he, Keir Starmer, Emmanuel Macron, Albanese, not Francesca, Albanese, the Prime Minister of Australia, the Zionist Prime Minister of the Australian Labour Party, and Mark Carney, the Canadian Prime Minister, did something which was completely out of character, but they had to because they needed to show that they're doing something in order to move away from the complete and utter support of the Ben-Gvirs and the Smotriches and the Netanyahus of the world, of Israel, and they declared that their recognition of the Palestinian state, which was, of course, a tokenistic thing to do. They did it in a manner which confirms that they were never interested in the formation of a Palestinian state. They were simply interested in showing to people that they were losing from their electorate that they were doing something in order to balance their support of the Zionist genocide with something that looked pro-Palestinian. And the apotheosis of that moment, when the movement, with your flotilla being at the forefront, changed the facts on the ground, was the Trump-Netanyahu plan for Gaza. My view is that what you did the manner in which your flotilla, as well as all the demonstrations and the March of Gaza and so on, this movement, of which the flotilla was the crowning moment, caused Donald Trump to step in and save Netanyahu and save his maddened Zionist mates in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. Because this is what Trump did. Trump is a very astute follower of public opinion. He could see that Israel was losing the propaganda war. In an interview that he gave recently after the Gaza plan was adopted and celebrated by the powers that be, he came out and said, Israel was losing the war, the propaganda war. Netanyahu was losing it, and I needed to step in and save him. And the way in which he did it, by means of a plan that is an affront to civilization, it's an affront to international law. It is like a scenario, a script that Philip K. Dick would write. This is a science fiction writer. If he was on very heavy hallucinogenics. The idea that there's a company that is presided by Trump with a CEO who is a war criminal called Tony Blair, and that they will come in and this company, not a country, for the first time since the Dutch East India Company or the British East India Company, a company would annex a colony. Nevertheless, that plan is never going to, was never intended to be implemented. It was put forward in order to stop the bombings, to let some humanitarian aid in, and to save Netanyahu from himself. It's testimony to the extent to which humanity has lost the plot, that somebody like Trump is necessary to come in to stop the killings, actually to pause the killings, which is something. I mean, something that should never have been enough. Nevertheless, came only because of activism like the one you were involved in, which forced Ben-Gvir, forced Netanyahu, forced Smotrich to put on display globally their total madness. Richard III-like madness, which caused who? Donald Trump to be the adult in the room to come and say stop. So is this a victory or is this a defeat? It's both. But it's a kind of small victory that buys us time, buys time for Palestinians in Gaza. And it is a defeat because when you have the Palestinian Authority embracing that plan, effectively it embraces colonialism, which of course, on the other hand, some people will survive. They will not be killed in the next few months because of that defeat. So it is a victory. And, we need to applaud all of us, people like David Adler, who, put the only thing they have, the only asset they have out there, that is their body. You put your bodies out there in order to be abused so that a half-baked, ridiculous plan can be implemented, at least to save some lives and buy humanity a little bit more time in order to make amends.
Thank you, Yanis. A couple of questions from the chat. I mean, somebody commented that we're annoyed that the peace treaty is around now, is about now, because we presumably our cause, we've lost the cause, but I don't think that's the case at all. And what you've just defined is a very good answer to that. But a couple of questions on the specifics. David, if I can ask you maybe to tackle these quickly. Kat Terrell would like to know if any other boats were sunk by ramming. And Paul Johnston, and I'm just giving you this to prove that we don't mind a bit of confrontational discussion. Was your intention to enter their waters illegally, asks Paul. Were you entering a conflict zone? And if so, why take elderly and sick people with you? Perhaps you can tackle those, David, before we move on to the next segment.
Sure. So I think it's really helpful questions to do some myth busting around what the flotilla is, was, and will be, because I can say already that we're so undeterred, so unintimidated that we're already planning the next one for 2026. And that helps me come to the protocol for these delegates, which is everyone comes with their own shared moral conviction. You might be a graduate student in Malaysia, you might be a mother in Southern Colombia, you might be a retiree in Menorca. Everyone's coming, young, old, fresh, or veteran to the Palestinian cause from the shared moral conviction that if the states of the world are not going to do anything to stop this genocide, to break the siege, to help the people of Gaza, to end the occupation, well, then normal people are going to take matters into their own hands. So everyone comes prepared and well trained in various protocols of nonviolence, various trainings to understand what exactly we're up against, and no one is deluded, even if we're prepared to fight and go into the end, so much so that when the Israeli Navy pretends to set up some kind of blockade in international waters, we keep going and until we can't go anymore. That brings us to this question of, were we entering illegally their waters? The siege of Gaza is not just inhumane, it's also illegal. The State of Israel, as it has done many times in service of its greater Israel vision of territorial irredentism and expansion, has simply drawn a line in the sea and said, yeah, you can't cross this. Now, when I speak to a home audience, I talk about my home state of California, where I was born and raised, and I asked the question there about how we'd feel if the Communist Party of China regulated what goods could get into the beach, the port of Long Beach, or were sniping children who were sort of swimming in the Pacific Ocean. But I can equally ask that in a European context, how we would feel, let's say, if the United States were to tell you that you can't go to the beaches of southern France or the Spanish coast, and were to decide not just where you could go, but with whom you could communicate, conduct commerce, that had totally snuffed any prospect, as enshrined in international law, of your self-determination. In Europe, since February 2022, there's been a lot of talk about territorial sovereignty, territorial integrity. It's become a principle that Europe stands behind in the course of the Ukraine war, after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that we believe that it's an unserious conversation of international law unless we're talking about full and total territorial integrity. No land should be taken from the people of Ukraine. And that, if it's a very reasonable, sound interpretation of international law, but it's not one that they apply similarly to the people of Palestine, whether that's in the West Bank, encroached day to day by settler violence and new settlements, steal their lands, menace their olive harvest every year. And it's certainly not one that applies to Gaza, whose ports have been destroyed, whose airports have been destroyed, and whose borders are managed for the agriculture that can go in and out, what little remains of arable land in Gaza after these bombings, and certainly what people can come in or out, and what goods can be transferred or can be shipped, traded from outside Gaza. So it is to fall directly into the trap of Israeli propaganda, to ever admit the legality or the legitimacy of that line drawn across the Mediterranean Sea that prevents Gazans from controlling their own access to their own shores. And so that doesn't mean that we were delusional about our prospects, but this is a rich tradition of nonviolent resistance. When we encounter institutions that are so violent and so illegitimate in their application, what is our responsibility? Our responsibility as a sort of civil disobedience with respect to the institution is to confront it time and again, revealing the structure of its violence and revealing the absence of its legitimacy. Rosa Parks, was it illegal for African Americans, for Black folks in the United States to sit at the front of the bus? Well, in many states it was. These were state-sanctioned segregated systems. What did Rosa Parks do? She said, I'm not going to respect this illegitimate institution that may be enshrined in law, but we don't respect it as legal. And time and again, people stood up in the course of the civil rights movement in the United States, just to take one example from my country of origin, and they made the case that these were illegitimate, if legal, practices that needed to be abolished and dismantled by a broader movement, and succeeded in this course. The same is true with these institutions that restrain, detain, restrict any form of self-determination by the people of Palestine. It is our obligation to continue confronting those institutions as pacifists in civil social ways, but forever disobedient in the DM25 style of civil disobedience. Now, I like to think that, in contrast to what Yanis was setting up before, I have more than my body to offer. I also have a mind, I also have other things that I can bring to the table, I'm teasing. But I think if that is what we can offer, whether you are young or you are old, whether you are able-bodied or you are infirm, the people who were on those boats, who inspired me to go on those boats. I was never supposed to be on that mission. I was just going to go and from the Progressive International help to mobilize some contacts in Spain, unblock the port of Barcelona if it was necessary, bring some of our allies in Catalonia down to the port so they could celebrate the departure of these boats. But it was precisely those old people, it was precisely those students, it was precisely those ordinary citizens who inspired me, who I thought, who am I not to share this moral conviction, not to have the courage to join a mission, to put my body on the line as they were doing. Does that mean that there couldn't have been casualties? No. Does that mean there couldn't have been fatalities? Absolutely not. And we were all very clear-minded about those prospects. But does it mean that it is necessary to engage in these acts of confrontation as a rich tradition of civil disobedience? I absolutely believe so, and I've never believed so more than coming out of Katziot and speaking to you now on the other side of that experience.
I'd like to have a go, Mehran, too.
Yep, go on.
I hope Paul Johnston, who asked this question, is still with us, because I would like to say to you, Paul, that first, you ask is, was their intention to enter their waters, illegally? Well, you can check it for yourself. In June 2024, the International Court of Justice, or not criminal, the International Court of Justice, issued, after many years of deliberations, a verdict. And the verdict was that the Israeli state was illegally occupying East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza, and ordered, that's the International Court of Justice, ordered Israel to move out of those territories and obviously to stop occupying their territorial waters. So to answer your question, Paul, directly, who entered those waters illegally? It was the Israeli Navy. The Israeli Navy, by being in the territorial waters of Gaza, was in direct violation of international law and the verdict and order of the International Court of Justice of June 2024. In the same way that, for instance, and David, you mentioned that, I'll borrow your example. It's a bit, how would you have felt if Putin had declared that the waters of Mariupol in Ukraine were Russian waters, as he has done, and claimed that anybody who enters those waters outside without the permission of the occupying forces of Russia is doing so illegally? You would have said, no, that is, it is Putin that is violating international law, not a humanitarian convoy bringing nothing more than, baby formula and some wheat. The second question you asked, had you been warned by the sovereign state? What does sovereignty mean? They have no sovereignty over Gaza. I just made the point that international law decrees that Israel is not a sovereign state in Gaza. If we took seriously the second question of yours, then we would grant any sovereign nation or state the right to occupy any other sovereign nation. Your second question is pregnant with a recipe for international war, for global war. And the last point you made, so why did you take elderly and sick people with you? I think that David answered it brilliantly, but I feel the need to reinforce this. How dare you, Paul, insinuate that these people were carried or taken? These are magnificent people. Maybe they're frail, maybe they suffer from diabetes and they need insulin, but they chose to go there to make the point, like Rosa Parks, like so many activists around the world, that they are not going to accept the illegal occupation and the breakdown of international law by a bully rogue state that, because it is sovereign, thinks it has the right to occupy other people's land and claim sovereignty over them just because some book said so 5,000 years ago.
Thank you for that, Yanis. Okay, well, I just wanted to move to the second segment now. We're running a bit over time, but as I mentioned in the intro, Gaza was also like a playground for some of the latest shiny military toys from big tech and defense startups. Like I think we've all heard of Project Lavender, this horrendous sounding AI-powered kill list generator that Israel was using to target Palestinians, and based apparently on what WhatsApp groups people were joining and how often they had changed their address and how likely they were to be a militant. And then there was minimal human intervention, and the AI system recommended how could these people be killed, this bomb, that system, etc. And it just happened and went ahead. And that's a horrendous preview for the kind of dystopia that that these kinds of technologies have in store for us, including over here in Europe. So, David, since we have you with us, maybe it would be a good segue just to ask, during your, the harassment of your boat in international waters and also your detention, did you come into contact? Do you have any sort of first-hand direct information on those kinds of technologies? I know they were trying to jam your signal, for example, on the boat during detention. Did you witness? Did you experience any of these things? Just so that we can understand what kinds of things they're using.
Yeah, I think that, first of all, we shouldn't think of big tech exclusively in the form of software. I mean, a lot of these same companies are now sort of cross-subsidized or closely linked with the development of more serious, terrifying hardware. I stay up at night very anxious about the revolution in drone technology that is being pioneered in the Donbass and Gaza, but is very quickly boomeranging back to places like the Met Police in London, whose first responders are now going to be these drones, armed, of course, with technologies that are supplied by these big tech corporations you're describing, Mehran. So there were definitely instances where we were very bombarded with these Israeli technologies. It wasn't just jamming of signals; it was also hacking of phones, getting into our devices through our Wi-Fi devices that we had on the boats. And then it was also these drones that were deployed by quadricopter to send incendiary devices to destroy our boats and to deter participants from sailing across the sea. So I think that there's an important nexus there between this malicious software aided and embedded by large corporations that Yanis is much better equipped to speak about, the Microsofts, the Metas, the OpenAIs, who've been revealed to be so complicit in the course of this genocide, and the hardware stuff. It has the same people. It's Eric Schmidt, who was the CEO of Google, who is basically using Ukraine as a backyard for playground for new drone technologies that they're developing there to create these killer bots that will come for us all sooner or later. And of course, the same corporations are present in Israel's genocide in Gaza. So I think that it was an important battlefield around this stuff. But I would be reluctant, before I pass it to Yanis, who is going to be much more better informed about these issues and their implications for us as European citizens. I'd be remiss not to say that the flotilla would not have been possible in the impact that Yanis was describing before, as the crowning kind of moment for a wave of mobilizations on land, were it not for the technologies themselves, right? So it's not just, we can't be pure Luddites about this and just say technology is nothing but a force of repression and oppression and attacks on us. Because without the ability to communicate from the boats, without the ability to transmit live the CCTVs and the live streams and the discussions, and without the ability for us to be so connected, vitally and virtually connected to those land-based mobilizations, it would not have been possible for this to be such an important global action. I think we shouldn't lose sight of that aspect. The positive aspect of technology is a force that still sustains a degree of community making across territory, as well as the efforts to usurp those same emancipatory technologies to repress and destroy and dislocate those same kinds of communities. So I guess that was a bit of my experience on the positive and negative aspects of technology and the role that it might play in a flotilla, but also in broader kind of solidarity movements as they are expressed on the European continent and elsewhere.
Thank you. Yanis, your comment on big tech's war machine?
I'm not going to repeat anything of what David said, just because I agree entirely with all of it. I'm going to bring a different perspective. If you look at the New York Stock Exchange, about 50% of the value of all the companies in the New York Stock Exchange are due to what I call cloud capital. The form of capital that lives in the cloud. Not just Google and Uber and Airbnb and Microsoft, but all the companies that are managing to extract value from the rest of society using the cloud, what I call cloud capital. We know that America would have been in deep recession now if it wasn't for all the money that hundreds and thousands of billions, that, in other words, trillions, that are being invested in what's referred to as AI. And we know that these machines, this cloud capital, is useless unless you train it on actual data of what people do, think, how they move, what they buy, how they kill each other, how they relate to one another. This is the stuff that propels this cloud capital accumulation. The problem that they have with AI is that they are running out of data. Now, the killing fields of Ukraine, but much more so the Palestinian population, are a field day for these companies. And it's not new. It's now 10, 12 years ago since Israel gifted IBM initially, Microsoft after that, Google and Amazon, and more recently Palantir, these behemoths of the New York Stock Exchange, gifted Israel, the government of Israel, gifted these companies the right to 24-hour, 7-day-a-week surveillance data of the entire 7 million population of Palestinians. The Palestinians in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, in Gaza. That's before the 7th of October latest episode in the ethnic cleansing genocide of the Palestinian people. The more the genocide was amplified, the more bombs fell, the more the population was shifted around by the ADF from one part of Gaza to another. The more movement, anguish there was, the more data there was to collect. And they are collecting it as if there is no tomorrow. And, in other words, for the first time, you have a genocide which is actually lucrative in terms of capital accumulation in the West. So far, the genocides committed by the British Empire, by the Germans in Namibia and so on, the purpose of it was just to claim the land and whatever fruits the land delivered to them. But now you've got the actual genocide, the actual killing, creating data which feeds the machines that, because of this feeding process, accumulate cloud rents. And you can see the skyrocketing of their valuations in the New York Stock Exchange and in other stock exchanges. But just to connect with what David was saying, David was saying that he loses sleep over the developments of drone technology. Well, it's a combination of drones and this cloud capital accumulation that humanity is going to face up to, because it's a clear and present danger for humanity. It's becoming an existential threat on a par with nuclear warfare. And the reason is this. As we've seen in the Ukraine, killing fields, more so than in Gaza, because in Gaza it's one-sided. Israel is killing the Palestinians. End of story. In Ukraine, you have a kind of equilibrium of fear and loathing and killing. And what you see there is that the task of the drone masters of the Russian army and of the Ukrainian army, their task is to avoid being blocked by the other side. And the only way genuinely to secure your drones, to make sure that they're not blocked and that they don't fall out of the sky without any direction, is to cut them loose from humans. Otherwise, they disable far more easily by the enemy. So to avoid the jamming of your opponent, you need to enable your drones with cloud capital that is autonomous and can actually find and kill people without any human intervention. That's one trend, one aspect of the techno-feudal military cloud capital logic. The second one is that because those machines work very fast and they can make calculations that are impossible to match by human beings, the sheer volume of targets that they select for the drones to hit is such, the sheer volume of that it is impossible for the President of the United States to give the okay, hit that target, because there are so many. It's impossible for the President of the United States, for the Prime Minister of Israel, for whatever leadership, even if it is even if you have 100 officers choosing the targets, it's impossible, because it's impossible for them to assess the countless targets that cloud capital generates. So in the end, you're going to have cloud capital deciding which of the targets that cloud capital has selected will be sent to the autonomous drones to go and shoot at. And that whole process is part and parcel of the massive valuations of these AI companies, which are exploiting and extracting these data sets from the killing fields of Ukraine and of Gaza. And that is a dimension that the peace movement must take very seriously into account. And this is why it is impossible to sue for peace without challenging the ownership structure of the newest form of capital, and that is AI cloud capital.
Thanks for that, Yanis. But while you still have the floor, I think you know what I'm going to ask you, because I'd like to leave our audience on a positive note. What can be done? This technology is already here in Europe in meaningful ways. Poland, I just read today, signed a contract with Palantir. It's being used to police protests in Germany, this kind of drone technology. So while traditionally we might say, and David also suggested, boycotts, these are direct connections between very discrete defense companies and ministries of defense. So there isn't a consumer angle to it. So what would you suggest are the pressure points?
To give David the final word, let me come in first. Look, BDS. Firstly, you need to boycott, divest from Israel, and sanction Israel in order to stop the war that generates the data that feeds the monsters of Silicon Valley. You're not going to attack Palantir now. You're not going to attack Google. This is impossible. But we can impose on our governments a very simple agenda that they should know that they're going to fall if they don't put pressure on Israel through BDS. That's doable. That's manageable. We've already managed to shift the needle, to force some of them to recognize the state of Palestine, to force them to come in as Trump came in and stop the bombing. When it comes to Ukraine, we have to end the nonsense that it is the right of Ukraine to become a member of NATO, and every Ukrainian has to die until Ukraine becomes a member of NATO, for instance. So we have to sue for peace, not in Trump's sense of taking over the minerals of Ukraine, but a European road towards an immediate peace in the Ukraine. I mean, the DiEM25 already has an agenda for that. We already have a policy for that. That's the one we should be pursuing. When it comes more generally, what do we do about cloud capital? Well, this is why we are radical leftists, because what was the left from the 19th century onwards? It was a movement that said one thing: the machines are fantastic, steam engines are beautiful. Today, industrial robots, cloud capital, we need it. David made the point. We wouldn't be able to be communicating now without Zoom, right? Without YouTube. So we are not Luddites, but we know that unless and until these machines are socialized, they become social property rather than the property of the 0.0001%, they will continue to be instruments against humanity and nature for that matter.
Thank you, Yanis. David, last word is yours. What can be done?
First, I think we need to fess up to the fact that, as Yanis pointed out, this peace process took us 2 steps back in Europe. Simple things like the measures Ursula von der Leyen was forced by these mobilizations to take on the EU-Israel agreement have now been removed. The vote on Israel's participation in Eurovision that was supposed to take place has now been suspended. We've lost momentum that carried us forward on the flotilla as wind at our backs, but also carried forward these policy changes on land. So we can't be distracted by the great winds blowing around, especially in the United States geopolitical designs that seek to distract us from some of these causes that motivate us, that reach our hearts and break out into a collective form of action in defense of humanity. We need to recover from 2 steps back to take again 3 steps forward. But I think ultimately, I guess I'll end in the kind of advertisement for DiEM25. One thing that became abundantly clear to me is just how much the future in Europe remains unwritten. That the continent really is redefining its role in the geopolitical order for worse, but in ways that are moving. It still remains, I think, the most tried and true slogan 10 years later, that Europe will be democratized or it will disintegrate. It will disintegrate morally. It will disintegrate in terms of these technologies that are deployed to destroy and disrupt our communities, to infiltrate our phones, and to prevent us from living any kind of promise of democratic values, principles, or institutions. And it will disintegrate socially in terms of the virus of Zionism, but its attendant violence that has come to affect, as Yana was saying before, so many of our own governments. So I think that my feeling, as well as my message, is not a naive one, but it is a hopeful one, which is that I've never believed more in the capacity of popular mobilization to affect real change and to keep to make a nightmare for the malicious people that pretend to govern us day to day and speak in the name of our principles and our values and our great traditions. And so I think that it's an exciting time to be in Europe, and it's an exciting time to be a DMer. It's an exciting time to be part of these conversations, because I really think that things can change and will change, and we will win. And it's a question of when and how, and whether we can live out the dream of Palestinian liberation in our lifetimes, and of democratic of real democracy in Europe as well.
Thank you very much for that, David. 2 quick comments from the chat before we close. Evie notes that today Netanyahu has just broken the ceasefire by announcing new strikes on Gaza. And Hezia says the flotilla gave many people inside and outside of Palestine hope. When some humans are showing the darkest side of humanity, you are reminding us what makes human life worth protecting. Thank you for that. And as David said, the future in Europe remains unwritten. So if you would like to join an organization that's trying to help to write it, that's dm25/dm25.org/join. Join us, dm25.org/donate to donate to us. We have no big backers. It's all small donations from you guys out there. Thank you again to our panel and to you out there for your comments and questions. And we will see you at the same time, same place,